Welcome to Homestead Gardening in the Texas Gulf Coast. I'm Kristen Howard, and today we're going to talk about how to prune shrub roses at the right time of year for the Houston area specifically, as well as tools that you're going to need to not only prune the roses correctly, but maintain the health and safety of both the roses and yourself. Most people don't know how easy it is to own a rose in their garden and maintain and care for it. It's actually one of the easiest things to grow in Houston, despite how humid the area is. Roses only take 2 interventions per year for regular maintenance and spot checking throughout the year to make sure a fungal, disease, or pest infestation does not get out of control. The best times of year to maintain this shrub rose are going to be mid-February in Houston, or late winter, early spring in whatever area you are in, and again at the end of summer, or roughly early September for Houston, in order to make sure that you are taking care of the plant before a second flush of blooms in fall. Our goal for pruning is to optimize the health of the plant and optimize not only the quantity of blooms, but the size of blooms that this plant can produce in a single year or in a single growing period. In order to do that, we have to remove dead and diseased material first, open up this canopy for a little bit more airflow, especially because we're in Houston and we have more humidity. We need to make sure we do not have any issues below the rose, remove any leaves or weeds that are going to increase the amount of disease and infestation potential for the plant during this season. And we need to specifically prune to remove small, spindly branches and locations on the plant where a bloom will not be fully realized. First, let's talk about the tools that you're going to need to accomplish this goal. You'd be surprised how few people remember to wear gloves when they work on the garden. I, for one, hate wearing gloves. They're not comfortable, but for rose pruning or maintaining around a rose, they're the most important thing. I don't use regular garden gloves when I work with roses. I only use leather gloves, and specifically I like to use what is called a gauntlet glove. Any glove that's going to go up the arm. If you have a leather jacket or a jacket that can protect your arms, or a long sleeve shirt that's not going to snag, that's a great option as well. But in Houston, that's a little bit more difficult to do since we're a warm weather climate. So the gauntlet gloves are going to take care of that for me. Additionally, we want a few tools. Now, the most obvious is going to be a pair of pruners. Specifically, we want bypass pruners. Bypass pruners has the blade actually bypassing the anvil and will not crimp the branch. Crimping the branch just promotes death and disease on the plant. If your rose is more out of control or has larger stems, you may need something a little bit more serious to prune your rose, but you also need something that will help you maintain your tools. A sharpener can be used on the actual blade with a few passes to sharpen, and then one pass on the back side to clean up any burrs. You also want to sanitize your tools in between your cuts from one plant to another. And you can do that very, very easily with some rubbing alcohol, and just quickly wipe the blade before you move on to the next plant. This shrub rose is out of control, and we have a lot of maintenance to do, not just on the shrub itself, but on this weedy area at the base. So the first thing we're going to do on this shrub rose is take off 30% of the height. We're going to choose an outward facing bud on a large thick stem and cut just above that at a 90-degree angle, as close to the bud as possible. We're trying to reduce the amount of surface area for any pest, disease, or any problems to get into this larger shrub. Now we're getting into some of the trickier canes, and we actually have a lot of cross-cutting canes, but instead of worrying about which cross-cutting canes need to be removed, we're just going to take everything down to this height first and make the hard decisions a little bit later. So my goal is going to be to choose canes that stay, that are at least a pencil width around. So this cane and this cane are actually great candidates to stay on this plant. And what I have to decide is if they're in prime locations to allow roses to come off of. Because all of my outward facing buds for this location on the plant go into the interior and will run into this cane, I'm actually going to cut much further below and make decisions on how to maintain this cane a little bit later. So I'll come to this side, I'll find an outward facing bud and cut just above that. Since we have some dead material, we'll remove that now as well. This branch has a lot of dead material on it and looks like it's been very unhealthy all year. I'd really prefer to cut this much lower than the 30%. I think I want to go to 50% on this just to optimize the health of the plant. And I'm going to do this right above an outward facing bud as well. Okay. We have our big canes cut, and now in order to decide what else we can do with this plant, we really need to start weeding, and that's where our gauntlet gloves are really going to shine. After weeding the space, I found a lot of dead material or dead branching that probably occurred because we had a lot of weeds at the base to begin with. And it's a little bit difficult to reach and cut low enough on this. So I'm going to use my pruning saw and get a little bit of a closer cut. All right, I think we're done with the pruning saw and we can get to our fine pruning. Now I have 6 canes left on this shrub rose. I can have about 5 to 7 is a good number. And because these 2 canes are pencil width or larger canes, I'm going to keep all 6 today. What I need to do though is find an outward facing bud that's not going to cross these other canes. And I have found one here that will go right in between the other 2 canes, and that will allow me to keep a little bit more of this shrub rose. And if you'll notice, we probably took this cane down by about 50% from its original height, maybe even a little bit more, and that's okay. This cane was much, much larger than all of the rest, and I really like this shrub rose to be a little bit more uniform. So we're gonna take a tiny bit more off of this. Nothing that's too noticeable, and leave the shrub with 6 canes, all at about waist height or a little bit higher. In this example, this drift rose is 5 years old and has had its first pruning. And because of that, the branches are going to be a lot bigger, a lot thicker, and it's easier to cut these. A smaller drift rose may be more challenging, but for this example, I have 2 heights shown. I have a severe pruning, and I have a pruning that you may be more comfortable with because a drift rose is a landscape rose. You may want a little bit more height to stay on the rose. Just make sure you follow all the same instructions for a shrub rose, cutting above an outward facing bud, just like this, and making sure that everything at the base of your plant is pulled away. You'll notice how many leaves and weeds and other debris are gathered around this shrub rose, and what a difference it makes to have that pulled away. The next step for this drift rose, just like a shrub rose, is to make a little well around the root zone. Add fertilizer, about 1 cup per small plant and 4 cups for a large shrub rose or climbing rose this time of year. And then go ahead and apply mulch. That will cover any remaining leaves that are around this base, and make sure that you lock in the moisture and begin the process of using that fertilizer right away. It's raining today, but otherwise you may want to water in that fertilizer to get everything going a lot quicker. When you're mulching, make sure you have 1 to 2 inches of mulch on top of the soil, and make sure that any mulch that gets too close to the base of any of your shrubs or trees or anything else that you're mulching this season gets pulled back just a little bit to avoid moisture gathering at this base and creating new disease and fungal problems. I bet you didn't know that there is a different way to prune a shrub rose than a climbing rose. The biggest difference is timing, blooming period. For this climbing rose, it has 2 blooming periods, spring and fall, and it can be pruned both times, but usually you're going to prune a climbing rose at the end of spring before summer, after it's finished its showy bloom time. You can arrange the branches on a fence line or a trellis at any time, but if you would like a climbing rose to bloom, there's one thing that you absolutely must do in addition to fertilizing. This cane must have a small bend in order to signal to the plant that the cane can have blooms on it. This portion may have blooms because it's naturally bending, but I may not have blooms anywhere else on this cane. In order to maximize blooms, I actually want to train all of these canes, and so I'm going to do not an end pruning on this rose, but I'm going to do a cleanup before it blooms, and I'm going to remove a few canes that cannot be secured to the fence line, as well as any dead growth, to prepare it for that spring bloom period.